all this campaigning going on, it's always a good time to talk to my next guest because he is, among other things, Washington bureau chief for The Intercept. He's also author of an upcoming book entitled We've Got People, about the populist or left wing of the Democratic Party, and both of those things are in play right now. What's going on in Washington, what's going on around the country with that populist wing. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you once again, because he's been on the show before, Ryan Grim. Ryan, thanks for coming back on the program.
It's great to be back.
And congratulations for what struck me as a very laudatory, or certainly influential, impressive piece of coverage for you and your team in Politico.
Right. It starts off, you think it's going to be a hit piece, and some people maybe in the center of the party would read it and say, boy, they really got theirs, didn't they? But I actually grew to really like the piece. It was in Politico magazine, if people want to check it out, about the Intercept's kind of dive into political coverage over the last year and a half.
I liked it too. I mean, sure, there were a couple lines in it, like, they go after the Democratic centrists very aggressively, and my reaction is, you say that like it's a bad thing,
Right.
So no, I thought it was a great piece, and I thought you in particular came off really well there, and I liked the person who tweeted out the picture of you and your staff and said something like, I don't know, CSI. It was like one of those. It was like one of those. I don't know if that makes you David Caruso or who that makes you, but let's start. There's a lot going on that I want to touch base with you on, Ryan. But before we get started, your book is coming out, in about 6 weeks or so?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The full title is We've Got People, From Jesse Jackson to AOC, The End of Big Money and the Rise of a Movement. So let's get the business out of the way first. Where can people go to pre-order a copy? Because I'm told that pre-ordering copies is a really good thing for authors.
Yeah, it lets publishers know kind of how popular it's going to be, so they can gauge what kind of energy to put behind it. I think you could get it at strongarmpress.com or whatever Strong Arm Press's website is. You can find it on my pinned Twitter, of course, because I've certainly been pushing it around there. But that's right. You can it's available for pre-order now, and you put your heart and soul into a book, and for almost every author except maybe George R. R. Martin, you worry at the last minute whether anybody's gonna buy the thing. And probably even Stephen King, every time he puts a book out, wonders if this one's going to sink to the bottom of the pond. So if you're on the fence about buying it, just buy it. Do our psyches a solid here.
Yeah, no, just buy it, because look,
just get it.
I'm going to do you a solid here, because first of all, I read an excerpt from it. I thought it was great. Secondly, it's super timely, and thirdly, some couple great writers like Naomi Klein and Osita Nwanevu both said it was really good. They said good things about it. So why not? And
why not? What do you have to lose?
Well, yeah. What do you have to whatever the cost of it is?
$15 or whatever it is.
$20 or whatever. So that aside, so it's maybe we should start here. Your book is about this populist wing of the Democratic Party, or left wing, or whatever you want to call it. Now I'm seeing, and I'm actually pondering writing about it myself, we're seeing the pushback from the party leadership. We're seeing the claim being made that, as Nancy Pelosi put it, that a glass of water could get elected in AOC's district because it's so liberal, which was a little bit of I don't want to be too harsh on the speaker, but it was a little bit of a cell phone, in the sense that that's also true of San Francisco as a district. Right. But that said, there is this feeling that progressives, if a very vague word, but if by progressive you mean the AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar types, they're only good for solid Democratic districts, and you need a moderate to win everywhere else in the country. I don't think that's a proven fact, though. And I've been looking at polling data that I think sort of substantiates my position here. But I was curious to know if you have any thoughts about this, because this strikes me as a continuation of a pushback that's been going on for 30 years or more.
Yeah, that's right. And it also ignores so many cases, where conservative Democrats have lost or have failed. If the Democratic Party were following the particular philosophy, outlined by a Nancy Pelosi or a Rahm Emanuel or Chuck Schumer, and it were dominating, it was winning the White House every year. It was running away with big majorities in Congress. And if let's say it's not doing Medicare for all, it's not doing the progressive stuff it says the American people don't want, but it's maintaining control of government, it's keeping the fascists back, it's incrementally improving the lives of the American people and getting rewarded for doing that, then the left wouldn't have a whole lot to be able to say. But that's not what's happening. So if your argument is that you are pragmatic and that your strategy is the one that ought to be followed, not because it's necessarily the morally best way to go, it's not the best way to organize a society, but it's the way to win, then you have to win, in order for that argument to follow. And they simply have not done so over particularly the last 10 years, but also over the last 30 years. And so, in my book, in order to write about the progressive populist wing of the party, you also have to write about their rivals within the party. And so that's why I talk about Jesse Jackson, and that's why I go deeply into the kind of 70s and 80s, where the Nancy Pelosi's and the Rahm Emanuels and the Chuck Schumers of the world, forged their own politics. And you know as much as anybody about that era, but a lot of people who have gotten interested in politics either through the Bernie Sanders campaign, through DSA, through an indivisible group after Trump was elected, really got into politics hardcore in the last couple of years, don't know a lot of this history, and it will help them make sense of why Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer are doing what they're doing, or feeling the way they're feeling, or arguing what they are, if they understand where they came from in the kind of late 70s and throughout the 1980s.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Ryan Grim, and I think it's one that gets lost sometimes in the heated discourse and struggle within the Democratic Party, and then between the Democratic Party and the establishment and the left. I think one of the things that gets said a lot by people on the left is that when a Nancy Pelosi or a Steny Hoyer or some other party leader attacks the left, and they do it a fairly consistent amount, and I would say Hoyer is more egregious than Pelosi and so on, but it happens a lot, and I think what the reaction you get sometimes from people on the left is, well, they've just sold their souls to bring in big money, and therefore they're just saying this because their corporate overlords are instructing them to, and they have no ethics and no morals and blah, blah, blah. But I think the truth is probably more complicated and nuanced, and maybe therefore trickier to fight against in that. I think the truth, and last time you and I talked, we talked about one of Nancy Pelosi's top aides, Wendell Primus, but I think this is probably true of the speaker herself and a lot of Democrats, that when they express these opinions, as triggering as they may be for those of us on the left, I think that they also, my guess is they genuinely believe them, that right. They've been steeped in a culture that has trained them to believe this, and this form of belief kind of validates much of their career, so they're invested in believing it. But what do you think? Do you think that's right, wrong?
I think it is right. And like you said, I don't think that necessarily makes it better. You almost wish that it were a put on or kind of some expression of corruption, because then if you can simply just clean out the corruption or point the party in a more effective direction, that then they'll follow along. But to your point, they have come to believe the things that they believe, having been kind of raised in them, bathed in them. A lot of our politics are formed by a lot of different things, but they're formed in our early 20s, our mid 20s, late teens sometimes, as we're coming of age, and a lot of people simply solidify in that time. Harry Reid is an unusual example, and I go into this in the book, of somebody who continued evolving politically with the times throughout his career. And he said to me, "You're not a good legislator if you don't evolve politically." But by his definition, 99% of legislators are not good legislators. And so people have to understand what the context was. So after Jimmy Carter lost, and Democrats lost the White House to Reagan, they lost the Senate to Republicans. They held on to the House of Representatives, and this was a key point. Not only did they hold the House of Representatives, they held what they thought was a permanent lock on the House. And there was reason to believe that. If you go back to the 30s, 40s, they had a mostly unbroken chain of dominance in the House of Representatives for 50 plus years. And in fact, they went on to hold it through the 80s and didn't lose it until 1994. But very few of them saw that they could even lose it as soon as 94. Even weeks before the 94 election, Democrats thought they were going to hold on to the House. It was just inconceivable that they would lose that. So that meant they didn't have to think that hard about what their party was. Okay, it's unfortunate that we lost to this Hollywood stooge, Ronald Reagan. It's unfortunate we lost the Senate, but we can win the Senate back. In the meantime, Republicans have figured out how to raise a lot more money, given the changes in campaign finance law, the kind of rise of capital in the 70s and 80s. And so what Democrats thought they needed to do was do a better job of fundraising, get up more on television, but overall they were okay. They didn't need to think much about what their coalition was going to be going forward. And that's why, so in 1984, 1988, when Jesse Jackson runs for president, they didn't look at his coalition, the Rainbow Coalition that he formed, as necessarily something they needed to be that curious about. What a lot of people have forgotten is that in '88, he almost stole that nomination. And by steal, I mean won the nomination. Steal it in the sense that nobody expected him to win. But after 37 primaries and caucuses, he was just like 8 or 9 delegates back from Michael Dukakis. This is after he had this huge upset win in Michigan. And you find that a lot of this history rhymes. Just as Bernie Sanders shocked the establishment in Michigan in 2016, Jackson did in '88 in Michigan. And that put him into Wisconsin, and he was polling well ahead in Wisconsin. He delivered a major speech there saying that the economic violence being done to the white, black, and brown working class needed to be stopped. Washington was in a full-blown panic because all of these people had thought, well, this is kind of interesting that Jesse Jackson is running. Isn't that cute? All of a sudden, he wins Wisconsin. He's on a glide path then to the nomination. Washington Democrats went to Mario Cuomo and started to organize. This is Andrew Cuomo's dad. Started to recruit him and were planning to run him at the convention. So if Jesse Jackson came into the convention as the leader, but with less than 50.1% of the delegates, they were going to run Mario Cuomo and kind of try to steal it from him at the convention. They were coming up with plans B, C, D, and E too, and everything they could think of to stop Jesse Jackson from winning the nomination, except asking themselves, why is Jesse Jackson about to win the nomination? What is it about this coalition of progressive whites, of black voters, of Hispanic voters, of the working class white voters who have not abandoned the party for Ronald Reagan yet, because a lot of them had not yet, and they actually responded to Jesse Jackson's call for land reform, for farm reform, and for against Reagan's kind of free trade agenda. That stuff resonated, even if they might have some racist tendencies as well. Sometimes your material concerns are more important to you than satisfying that. Coming into Wisconsin, though, he ends up losing. The polls were all wildly off, and a lot of what happened, I think, is that for a lot of his white supporters had been casting votes for him as kind of a virtue signaling. Like it was cool to vote for Jesse Jackson until you thought that he might actually win. And so when it was, wait a minute, this is not what I signed up for. So he lost Wisconsin. He picked up a decent number of primaries and caucuses after that, but from there, Dukakis kind of drifted away with the nomination, which goes back to our earlier point. If the pragmatic wing of the party was good at what they were doing, then okay, you could have a little more respect for their game. They nominated Michael Dukakis on the argument that he was more electable, which in hindsight, and at the time, is absurd. Michael Dukakis.
This history is fascinating to me. And again, we're talking with Ryan Grim, Washington Bureau Chief of The Intercept and author of the new book, We've Got People. It's interesting to me for a lot of reasons. Ryan, I was around at the time. I was not especially politically involved or doing a little journalism, but little writing. But I was in a rock and roll band, and the other guitar player didn't like Jesse Jackson because, as he explained, he don't like rock and roll. And that was because Jackson, of course, had a campaign to clean up music lyrics. But I did vote for Jesse Jackson. I think also probably white voters in particular, may have distanced themselves because he was getting a lot of protest votes initially, and they didn't, but that didn't necessarily mean they wanted him. But the choice of Michael Dukakis in retrospect is fascinating because people don't remember how deeply unpopular George H.W. Bush was at the time.
Right.
And the fact is that coming out of the convention, Dukakis had, I think, a 20-point lead or something phenomenal in the polls, which he proceeded to blow with extraordinary efficiency and expeditiousness. It was astonishing to watch this guy just implode. But the other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking about this history of this explosive growth for Jesse Jackson and this was at a time when the full stagnation and decline of the middle class in this country had not yet taken effect. There were, of course, large amounts of dispossessed Americans in the inner cities, already in the rural areas and so on. And wages were beginning to stagnate, but this was the tail end of the post-war prosperity for a lot of people. But I think a lot of people saw the writing on the wall. They were nervous about it, and along came somebody who promised to do something different, and it had some appeal, didn't it?
It very much did. And what Jackson was saying was that, look, you can make these economic appeals to people, and you can also expand the electorate. He goes through in one of his speeches the number of unregistered voters in states that Reagan won just narrowly. We look back at history as as something that was destiny, as predetermined. But at the time, none of these races were necessarily unwinnable for Democrats. Jimmy Carter almost won a re-election despite what a terrible job he'd done as president. Reagan kind of blew out Mondale in '84. Mondale is a pitiful, weird candidate. And like you said, there was a wave in '86 where Democrats kind of surged back in the Senate and the House Iran-Contra affair was tanking the Republican Party, and a ton of people ran for president in '88 on the Democratic ticket because they expected that it was going to be a year where they would be able to win. And yet they managed to lose to George H.W. Bush in an impressive feat. But Jackson's argument was, look, here's your coalition that's going to take the Democratic Party and make it a long-term majority. And central to it is inspiring people and going out and doing the door-to-door work of registering new voters. And he did. He registered a couple million in both '84 and '88. And in the book, I talk about how it, because of those registrations, it helped Clinton a ton in '92, ironically, but it helped elect the first black governor in Virginia. It helped elect black mayors for the first time in major cities, a lot of major cities across the country. But that was stunted. The party decided that wasn't, they would check a box and give a little bit of money here or there to voter registration groups, but it was central to Jesse Jackson's strategy, whereas it wasn't to the kind of centrist wing of the party. And so it took until then 2008 for this same coalition. Like Obama's coalition was the Rainbow Coalition. It was Jesse Jackson's coalition, but there was a wasted 20 years in between there.
Well, and it's fascinating to me too, Ryan, because what you're talking about is a tactical difference between, the Democratic left, let's say, and the Democratic centrist or establishment. It reminds me how far back the same split was manifesting itself, meaning that even then, but up to today, there's this sort of centrist wing that says what we need to do is carve up the existing electorate differently by tacking to the right and appealing to wavering Republicans or the mythical, I call them the mythical middle, but people supposedly in the middle between two parties, although polling doesn't show a lot of people in that space. So that's the establishment strategy, and the left strategy, which I hadn't tied to Jackson, but was expand the voter base, reach people who aren't voting, and by all means energize the base, including your own registered Democrats who don't turn out to vote. And that seems to me, to a large extent, to be the story of the Democratic failure of 2016 to win the presidency, is that you had voters who, everybody talks about the Bernie voters who didn't vote for Hillary or whatever, but they don't talk about the Democratic voters, base voters, black voters, other voters who stayed home in swing states and very arguably made the difference. So it seems as if this whole turnout versus appealing to the center has been a generations-long division in the Democratic Party. Is that true?
Yeah, very much. Even as Clinton benefited from it, in 1992 when he was running, most people are familiar with the Sister Souljah moment, or at least they know that it means that you're kind of turning on your own base. And this was a famous thing that Clinton did during his '92 campaign. But what I think a lot of people don't know is that the stage he chose to do that was at the Rainbow Coalition 1992 conference, so the summer of '92. So it's the height. He's the presidential nominee. It's the height of the presidential contest. Jesse Jackson is sitting on stage while Clinton pulls off this ambush, which is, for people that don't know about it, a totally obscure rapper named Sister Souljah, who has since become a talented writer and poet. But she was a teenage rapper at the time, had never been above, I think, like 88 on Billboard. He said, a lot of people follow the words of Sister Souljah, which was not true. Like, most people had never even heard of her at this point. And she had said in an interview that somebody asked her, why is the black community kind of burning its own neighborhoods in the LA riots right now? That's the thing that white people are always asking. Why are black people doing this? And she said, if you put yourself in the mindset of those people, this is not at all to be unexpected. You can find her quote, but he essentially goes on stage and compares her, and he literally compares her to David Duke and says that it's important, for everybody to condemn Sister Souljah. And I think one of his targets really was Jesse Jackson and the wing of the party that he represented. He wanted to show that the Clinton wing was dominant now, and Jesse Jackson demanded an apology for what he did on stage at his conference, and he never delivered the apology, which is another power move to say that no, I'm running things now. This is my party. So so part of it was to show he's going to stand up to his base, and by his base it meant black voters. The other part was to try to smash this forming Rainbow Coalition, which was the biggest threat to dominance within the Democratic Party.
Well, first of all, if I'd been Sister Souljah and someone had asked me why, and I had been a member of the black community, and somebody asked me why you were burning your own community, I would have said because I can't get to yours. But that's why I'm not in a position of responsibility anywhere, because I say things like that. The second and more important point is, so you have basically Bill Clinton doing a power move against his own base. It seems like it's appealing to the worst instincts of white voters who want to be distanced from that kind of politics, while at the same time, as you point out, benefiting from the voter turnout that Jesse Jackson and his organization and his wing of the party was able to generate for the party. And this seems to me to be an ongoing tension, a tension that goes to this day. But Brian, I wanted to go back to this point about evolving that you made earlier, and that Harry Reid evolved. It seems to me that there are ways in which the Democratic establishment evolves and ways in which it doesn't. And that to me is interesting. It seems to me that it is very capable of evolving on issues of marriage equality, of reproductive rights, we'll see about feminism in the age of Me Too now that Joe Biden's in the race, because he seemed to say I'll evolve, but then make.
Although let's take a couple of those, because those are interesting, and I go over this history in the book of the LGBT movement, for instance. That evolution was kind of forced on them. If you think back to 2009, 2010, the gay community had to, Get Equal came around and was protesting Obama everywhere he went, protesting Reid at Netroots Nation. Didn't have to push Pelosi as much, but generally direct action. Taking serious, making serious moves to show that the status quo doesn't work anymore, because left to their own devices, they were not going to evolve. And on abortion rights, if you look at the fight that Chuck Schumer didn't want to put up against Gorsuch, against the circuit court judges, against Kavanaugh, that's a hangover from the 1980s when people like Schumer believed that social issues, gay rights, women's rights, civil rights, were abortion rights were kind of hung around the party's neck, and they blame these kind of social issues. They believe that the white working class felt that Democrats had gotten too liberal, and were trying to foist a social agenda onto the American public. And you can show Chuck Schumer all the polls in the world that show him 80+% support for abortion rights. It doesn't matter. His lizard brain from the 80s tells him that it's controversial, and he needs to run away from this issue as fast as he possibly can, and get back on, baggage fees, or whatever
right.
else he's wherever he feels more comfortable. And so, yes, they've been capable of evolving on some of those issues, but only when they've been forced to, and not because they really changed on the issue. I think one of the great examples is the debt and deficit. In the 1980s, they all got tarred as tax and spend liberals, and if you talk to them today about this, they're still scarred from that time. That stings today. Like, the newer generation of progressives is like, what are you talking about? Like, that's a joke. Tax and spend liberal, get out of here. Who are you? Who do you think you're offending with it? Who do you think you're bothering with this? But if you call a Chuck Schumer a tax and spend liberal, or a Nancy Pelosi a tax and spend liberal, it's kryptonite to them. They melt before you. They believe that they didn't take the debt and deficit seriously enough in the 1980s and 1970s, and they were spending too much, and that cost them the support of the American people and allowed Republicans to become the party of fiscal rectitude, even though they were they were jacking up the military budget, they were cutting taxes, they were running up the deficit, but their rhetoric was different. So they are convinced that if they can win that rhetorical debate around government spending, the debt and the deficit, that's their path back to power. And I'm not going to relitigate the 1980s, but we're not living in the 1980s anymore. That's not the conversation that the American public is having anymore. But because their politics were forged in that time, they can't move past it. And so you have Nancy Pelosi coming in January of 2019 and pushing pay as you go back onto her caucus. And the only way to understand that is that these are scars from the 80s that are still healing.
Well, that's one way to understand it, Ryan Grim,
Well,
and an important way to understand it, I think. But going back to, and perhaps appearing to slightly contradict what I said earlier, I would not. I still puzzle over the question of how much of this is, is trauma from the 80s or programming from the 80s. And I know it's a huge part of it, that they really internalize this kind of. And there's also, there's kind of like when a child, what do they call it, differentiation or something, when a child separates itself from its parents, that they've differentiated themselves emotionally, I think, from New Deal Democrats, for example, and New Frontier Democrats by saying, we care about balancing the budget because we're modern Democrats. And now, 40 years after that's become outdated, or 20 years after it's become outdated anyway, because of new thinking in economics as well as new thinking by the public and so on, they're still differentiating from their political parents by being fixated on this. So I think there is a huge psychological and sociological dimension to it, but I also do wonder about the role of money in all this, because I know you have talked about, others have talked about, for example, I guess it's DCCC slideshow for new members of Congress, or that shows you should spend 4 hours a day calling people for money.
Right.
Well, there's a sociological phenomenon at work there too, which is if you spend 4 hours a day talking with people who have enough money to help you out in your congressional campaign or whatever, then you're immersing yourself in the culture of people who think these same things that you and I are talking about.
Right.
So I would think it gets reinforced on a daily basis when there's a fundraising dinner, when there's another type of event, when they're making their daily calls asking for money, that they're constantly getting, hey, okay, I'll send you $1,500, but don't get too crazy about this overtaxing and overspending like you guys like to do. Ha ha ha. I got to believe that's part of it too. But what do you think?
I think that's exactly right, and I think it gets very difficult and confusing to even talk about like somebody's nature or what they genuinely believe. After they've been after you've been doing something for 30 or 40 years, it doesn't matter anymore. What you truly believe. There's really no such thing as that anymore. The only thing that matters is what it is you're doing. And you can't, like, the person themselves can't even tell you what they, whether they actually believe it or whether they're doing it because the people that they're on the phone with 4 hours a day are telling them that, and it makes sense to them. And so, like you said, in a lot of ways, it's besides the point, and its roots again go back to that decision that was made that we're okay. We lost the White House, we lost the Senate, we still have the House, and we have the House, and so let's go to corporate America and say, look, we control the House of Representatives. If you want your agenda to be respected on Capitol Hill, pay up. And you can make the argument that the first time you do that, you're not going to be corrupted because you have the power over them. And you're saying, look, ante up, pay us. But anybody can see that on day 2, day 3, week 2, week 3, year 2, year 3, it has a corrupting effect. And so as House Democrats, and then brought that, which expanded then out to the rest of the Democratic Party in the 80s, began organizing itself around the extraction of corporate money to prop itself up as they saw their coalition kind of realigning itself a little bit, but not enough that they felt terribly threatened. They just wanted to prop it up with a little extra money and use that money to kind of fill the holes of the white working class voters who were heading over to Reagan. And then they wake up 10 years later, and they're a different party that believes in what Wall Street believes in, that believes in what the drug makers believe in, that believes in all the things that all of their corporate funders now believe in, and now they have to try to figure out how to win a majority back with an unpopular program, with a platform that the bulk of the country doesn't necessarily respect. And so you're up against, kind of at that point in the 90s, two corporate parties. Bill Clinton manages to win after 12 years of Republican rule, but he does so by going as far to the right as he thinks he has to, and that sets us up for where we are now.
Well, and I think that's a good segue to talking about where we are now, because where are we? I think it's very much in play, which is a huge improvement over where we were a few years ago, where it wasn't in play. I would say the old wing of the party was still in control back at that point. But with about, I guess we have about 3 minutes left or so, a couple minutes left. Do you see this primary struggle, for example, playing itself out as a battle between the two wings of the party that might more simplistically be described as the Bernie wing and the Biden wing? Or do we see the generational politics having a factor with, it seems to me, Beto, who you wrote about recently, has been eclipsed by Mayor Pete, and the women have been the sideline, which seems to me for a party that, says many of the right things, not all of them, about gender justice. Is shocking to me how quickly the women candidates, including Elizabeth Warren, have been sidelined. But do you see this as like the struggle, the 30-year struggle you've been describing, playing out once again, or is it going to be sidetracked, or do we just have no way of knowing?
I think it is part of that struggle. Two of the most prominent white progressive supporters of the Jesse Jackson campaign were Paul Wellstone, who tragically died in a plane crash early, and Burlington Mayor Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders very much is a product of that rainbow coalition. That's if you compare Jackson's platform to Bernie Sanders, you won't find a lot of daylight between them. He had single payer on there. He didn't have a Green New Deal, but he had a version of it from then. And so Sanders really invigorated the left in 2016. A ton of people from Sanders' campaign were responsible for Ocasio-Cortez winning. They helped founded Justice Democrats in 2018, and now with Elizabeth Warren, with Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, the others that you mentioned, and Sanders, you have an actual wing. It's not just Paul Wellstone. or just Russ Feingold or just the socialist senator from Vermont. You have an actual, strong base of power, and you have a new generation of progressives who are not scarred by the feeling of powerlessness of the 1980s, where leftists were just kind of commenting on politics and calling it all a corrupt game and watching it unfold. Instead, now they're playing in the game, and they believe that they belong there, and not only are they playing, that they're playing to win, and that hasn't been the case since before Jesse Jackson, and that's what makes this primary so different and so important too.
Well, I love that summary, and I love that state of play, and I know you got to run. So Ryan Grim, Washington Bureau Chief of The Intercept, and people Google We've Got People and the name Ryan Grim and pre-order a copy. I'm sure you'll find it there. Ryan, as always, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.